There we go. I think that should do it. And it does. Okay, wonderful. So last week, we ended up talking about a couple of reading passages. Fixed. Good. Thank you. So yeah, it looks like it's this Brandon, I'm assuming is your name, or Ramones. Do you have any particular questions? You're here. And usually I start by going into kind of just general ideas, but if you got any particular questions, it would be good for me to address those directly for you. If not, then I will pick a random exam and get into some questions. Usually people are most worried about the reading and the science portion, so that's kind of what I tend to focus on. And not to ignore the math and the English, but at least for the English and the math section, you just need to know your stuff, right? So if you're struggling on the English portion, head over to the Purdue Owl, get a good grammar guide, learn your rules, and then that exam becomes really, really easy. And the same goes for the math, right? If you don't know how to use matrices, if you don't know what trig functions are and you get a trig functions question, you're not going to get it right? There's just absolutely no shot. There's no amount of tutoring or kind of guiding that's going to get you that. Okay, so you said, I'm struggling most on reading. I read the passage for 3 minutes and answer for about 5 minutes. I always end up guessing under pressure. So first things first with the reading, kind of an obvious fix is you want to read more. Although if you are reading the passages in 3 minutes, that's pretty good. That's right about how long I would take to read. I talked a little bit last week about the preparation for the reading that I do so far as looking at the answers, looking at the questions before I read the passage. And a lot of people will tell you to do this, and then they won't tell you exactly what to do. So I'll go over that just a little bit again. We'll pull up a fresh passage. My reasoning is this. Let me pull up a reading passage from, let's grab, this is the June 2015 exam. So just a random one here, and I'll pull up passage 4 there. It's about something about Jupiter. I see planets, and let's see what's there. But I think in the past when I've taken exams, I've oftentimes during my studying thought, man, if only I just had the questions, studying would be so much easier, right? If I just knew what the exam was going to be, my life would be a heck of a lot easier. So let me lock the questions in here, and then the questions as well, of course. So my thinking is, instead of doing all of the reading and then figuring out what kinds of questions you need to ask, it makes a heck of a lot more sense, I think, to just start with the questions. But that's a tricky thing. It's not simply a matter of it's not simply a matter of just reading the questions. Because, for example, if I go to let's say I go to question 33 here, and I see, okay, as it's used in line 18, the term such exotica refers to. Well, if I just read that, but then I don't do anything with it, I don't make a mental note, I don't make it clear to myself exactly what I'm going to be looking for in the passage, that's a total waste of time. So it's not just a matter of looking at the questions. It's a matter of looking at the questions for the sake of finding useful, reasonable information. Okay, so again, at the end of last week's stream, I went into that, so I don't want to go into it as much. But just to kind of quickly address that, if I'm looking, again, here's the passage. If I'm looking at this, it may make sense to some to just go in and read, and that's okay. If you have a really strong memory or a really strong knack for the types of details that the ACT tends to ask you for, then that's fine. But usually what happens is students will come across 1 or 2 questions that they just, for the life of them, absolutely cannot find inside the passage, that ends up taking them for maybe 1 or 2 questions, 4 or 5 minutes. Right, and that costs them what otherwise would have been a really strong passage. So we'll just pull a random one. If I'm looking at the questions beforehand, to look at number 31, the first question in the reading passages is almost always a main idea question. You can ignore that. There's no reason to read that over. Again, if you're reading a passage and you don't know what the main idea is, you've got problems beyond the scope of ACT. So work on reading a little bit more. The same thing with 32. Just keep a note in the back of your mind that there are going to be technical terms. This is the fourth passage, so it's science related, and that's probably not very surprising to us. Again, that's more of a kind of a general writing style question as opposed to looking for kind of a specific piece of information. I'm more concerned, again, with the things that I would miss were it not for my reading the questions ahead of the exam. So if I see, for example, number 38, Number 38 here says, according to the passage, which of the following is a capability of the Kepler? That's something that I would be on the lookout for. And in this situation, I would actually go through the motions of reading the answers to the question as well. Especially because, for example, choices F and H both have numbers in them. That's really easy to find. If I go back to the passage and I search for the numbers 100,000 or 150, those might be pretty easy to skim through. It says, for example, here, they're talking about something with 150 light years out is a scorched hot Jupiter, etc., etc., etc. So look for something like that. You know you're looking out for the Kepler, right? That's the really strong piece of information from question 38 here. So I would just make a quick note to myself, looking for Kepler, something that it's able to do, and move on. The one thing that you absolutely have to avoid, though, when looking at the questions beforehand, is to get caught up on details that are not actually relevant to the question, right? So if they ask me what's a capability of the Kepler, and the whole passage is about the Kepler, whatever that is, then searching for Kepler is not helpful. Okay, so kind of make that determination early. If I go back to the passage and I find that I see the word Kepler everywhere, that's an issue. Right? But if I only find the word Kepler in a couple of places, right, I see Kepler here, I see Kepler here, then that might give me an indication that, okay, I can actually focus on Kepler capability for that question, okay? But again, at the end of the session last week, I went into some pretty strong detail, so I'd highly recommend, if you're struggling on the reading, I know people recommend all the time, read the questions beforehand, but it's not just a matter of reading the questions. It's a matter of getting information that, again, you wouldn't be looking for without having looked at the questions, right? If you read a question and you don't get anything out of it, you don't have a strong sense for what you're going to be looking for, then it's a total waste of your time, and you're really going to struggle to answer all 40 questions in just those 35 minutes. So I'll go into that a little bit more specifically. But again, that's in that last week's video, and the description gives you a link, a timestamp, exactly where I go through that. Let's see. So Taika, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, said, I recently took the school-administered ACT, and now I'm planning to take the April ACT. I'm totally fine with timing, but then I had timing issues on every section when I took it. What do you think was the problem? Yeah, so this happens to a lot of people, and the simple answer to that question, to at least generalize, is that people struggle for the real thing, obviously, right? When you're at home, or if you're at a tutoring center, or wherever you happen to be, if you're on your couch or sprawled out in bed taking an ACT, the concerns that you have about the real exam aren't there. You're comfortable, you don't feel that anxiety, you know that the results of that exam don't really weigh down on you. They're not deterministic in any way, right? If you get a 20 on your practice exam, that's not a real 20. Right, in just the same way that a practice 36 is not a real 36, right? So I know that a lot of students on the day of the exam, to kind of try and quell their anxiety, they'll drink a lot of coffee in the morning, and they'll get really hyped up about the exam, which is great. But if that doesn't mirror the conditions that you're taking your practice exams in, then obviously that's to your detriment. But again, to generalize, I think that's usually just an anxiety thing. I've felt that too. If I'm studying and I'm taking practice exams for university in the past, no problem. But I get there in the exam and I'll start shaking. My body gets cold, and it's really tough to grapple with, okay, it's the real thing here. So a couple of things you can do. Meditation is huge. And I don't mean strike a yoga pose and, downward facing dog with your hands in the air for 20 minutes. I just mean calm, collected, cool breathing for a couple of minutes here and there. Turn your phone off, go sit down in bed or wherever is comfortable for you, and just be for a little while. Get kind of in the mode of calmness and tranquility. That's something that you really have to practice on. So then when the real exam comes along, you're not at that moment trying to fidget your way into calmness. Another thing is that practice exams, if you're not taking real ACT practice exams, you're totally wasting your time. If you're doing a practice exam and it's not from ACT, stop, throw it out, don't do it. It's a complete waste. I've used a few metaphors before. It's like playing softball to practice for baseball. If you play piano, it's like playing on unweighted keys on a keyboard, and then you go to a real piano and you go, whoa, what's this? This is different. So do everything you can to make sure that the conditions in your practice environment mirror the conditions in your real testing environment. If you've never been to the school that you're taking your exam at, go and visit the school, walk around the grounds of the campus, familiarize yourself so that when you actually go and take the exam, you're comfortable, you feel like you're at home. The other thing too is it's really tough to be good at something. And if you've ever been good at something, you know what I mean. If you've had to give a performance or you've had to give a speech in front of people and you're just good and you have a decent amount of confidence, then when you go and do the real thing, if you make one tiny mistake, you crumble. Okay, if you happen to play music, I can give a really good example, and that's that if you're trying to learn a piece on piano that you're going to play for a crowd, and you learn every note by note exactly how to play it, if you miss one note, you're done, right? The performance is over. But if you're a great piano player, you know your scales, you've practiced for a really long time, if you make a mistake, no problem, you can at least play through the scale and get yourself out back into the chord progression that you're playing, or something like that. Yeah, if you're doing prep, you said the practice tests weren't real, it was really frustrating, that's a total waste of your time. Okay, it's just an absolute waste. Just don't do it. If you don't see the form code in the bottom left that shows you that it's an ACT, right, like 74G or A10, B4, whatever the case, don't do the exam. It's a total waste of your time. You need to do the real thing. Those are standardized. ACT pays a lot of money to make sure that those tests are consistent and that they'll scale consistently. So just don't do that. Make sure you're absolutely doing as best you can recent real practice exams. If you're doing the ones that are maybe older than 2015 or so, especially before they started introducing the comparison passages on the reading, then that's to your detriment. Just don't waste your time. But again, it's a matter of anxiety. It's a matter of preparedness and comfort. So do everything that you can to make yourself comfortable. One more thing, on the day of the exam, don't show up late, obviously, and don't show up thrown into the exam. Right? Read something before you go and take that ACT. If you just crack open and start doing grammar problems, your brain is going to have to catch up. If you haven't done any reading, you haven't done any math, you haven't done any science since the night before, you've got to play catch up, and it's a timed exam. You don't have time for that. So bring a book with you, bring an article with you, whatever you can. Read something, do a couple math problems, use your calculator before the exam. That way you hit the ground running and don't run into those time issues that you will be, or you said you have in the past. Okay, Amy or Ami, again, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that right, says, I'm struggling with the science section. How do I improve my time? And what are the certain topics that I should look over? So the biggest mistake that people make on the science section is they decide to treat it like they do the reading, which is also a mistake in my opinion, and they read the whole passage first. And they try to understand what's going on in the experiment. They try to understand what the scientists were doing, which is great if you're writing a research paper on the topic that's in that ACT science section, but you're not. You're just answering multiple choice questions. So let me bring up a science passage. We'll come back to this reading passage here a little later, but let me just grab, I'll take, this was from I'll go back to the June 2017 exam. Let me just grab a science passage out of there and see what we can make of it. Okay, so here's one. This is from June 2017, and this is something that you probably saw in chemistry if you've taken chemistry. So here's this. We'll just look at this for a bit. And if you were to open up this passage, and hopefully you don't have kind of PTSD flashbacks to chemistry or AP chemistry about molecular geometry, but if this comes up and you decide, okay, I have to read through the whole passage, I have to absolutely know what student 1, student 2, and student 3 think, that's a total waste of your time. Right? It's just an absolute waste of your time because you only want to go to the information that is necessary to answer the questions, right? So this passage happens to have 7 questions associated with it. Not all 7 of those questions, in fact, the totality of them, don't require that you know everything from the passage. So if you read everything, that's awesome, but you want to go straight to the questions and then go back and look for keywords in the passage, okay? Let me copy that second page of this passage, and we can work through some of these together. So again, I'd say the biggest mistake, number 1, don't read the passage. I mean, just really go straight to the questions and look for the answers as need be. Okay, so here is, and I think if I click, they'll, okay, good, perfect. So here are the actual questions from this passage. And so I'll just go straight to question 1, right? Question 1 says, it's down here, let me bring that into the view. Question 1 down here says, the table below gives the atomic mass in AMUs of the elements fluorine, chlorine, bromine, and iodine. I've said before in a previous video, there are a couple of things you should know for chemistry, right? There's some background that you should have. One of them is to know your chemical symbols and what the names mean. Hopefully you already did that for chemistry. But it just helps to kind of demystify the passages, right? When you have a little bit of familiarity, it takes it out of the realm of the unknown and brings it into something that you're more comfortable with, which is so important when taking an exam. Anyway, so if you look at F, Cl, Br, and I and go, oh my gosh, what are these? That's a problem. You should go, hey, those are my halogens, right? I've seen those before. I know a few things. But anyways, it says based on student 4's description. Well, okay, if I see a question that says based on student 4's description, I'm going to look at student 4's description, right? I mean, don't waste your time looking at anything else. So it says, among the elements, as atomic mass increases, atomic radius does what? So this is just a matching trends question, right? As one thing goes in one direction, how does another change in terms of its own directionality? So again, as atomic mass increases, well here, FClBri going downward, mass is increasing. So as we go from F to I, that's what it's really asking. As we go from F to I, what happens to atomic radius? Okay, so let me go to student 4, right? And let's see if he says anything about atomic radius, or she says anything about atomic radius. Well, let's see. The bond angle depends on the size of the atom, right? Because if I look at the table that student 4 gives me, it's bond angle, and I do see it goes FClBri, but question number 1 didn't ask me about bond angle, it asks me about atomic radius. Okay. By the way, what if I don't know what atomic radius is? Well, if you look at the question, that's italicized. That's going to tell you that atomic radius is a term that's introduced in the passage, right? They're going to give that to you somewhere, right? If not, that just means that you should know it, right? So if you look in the background of the text from the passage, if you see something that's italicized, take note of it. That means that that's a definition that you should know. So I actually don't see atomic radius here, but we should have a pretty good indication of what atomic radius means. In other words, it means the radius of the atom, right? The size of the atom. Okay, so again, bond angle depends on the size of the atom. The larger the atom, the larger the bond angle. So if I'm looking for larger atom, I'm looking for larger bond angle. And we see here that as we go from F to I, bond angle increases. Well, bond angle is directly proportional to size, right? That's the same as atomic radius. So I know, okay, hey, as I go from F to I, which is increasing mass, right, atomic mass here, that atomic radius increases only. Okay, so that should be a question that you answer in like 10 to 15 seconds. Okay, but what's really important is that along the way, you don't struggle and say, oh my goodness, I don't know what atomic mass means. I don't know what F, Cl, Br, and I are. I don't know what radius means. it tells you exactly where to go, right? It says based on student 4's description. So go there. It tells you exactly what you're looking for. As the elements in the table, mass goes up. Okay, going in this direction. What happens to radius? Okay, go and find where they talk about size. Don't make it tougher than it has to be, is really the name of the game. Let me look at 2 and 3. So it says, number 2, which of the students claimed that the AS, the arsenic atom in an arsenic trifluoride molecule, has a lone pair? Which one says it has a lone pair? Okay. So lone pair, lone pair, lone pair. Student 1 says it's T-shaped. The AS has a lone pair. Lovely. Student 2, trigonal planar. Does not have a lone pair, right? 1 says lone pair, 2 says no lone pair, 3 says lone pair, there's a lone pair. And then if I go to student 4, there's a lone pair, right? Due to a lone pair. So 1, 3, and 4, I circle H and I move on. Again, notice importantly that had I have gone through the whole passage and read through all of the information in the background, I would not have been able to remember, likely, which of those students said there was a lone pair. So just go straight for that information, right? Just go straight for that information. And skim, obviously, for the words lone pair. That's all you're looking for there, okay? So again, don't make it tougher than it has to be. Don't read that background. That's a huge strain on your time. Let me look at number 3 as well, and then we'll get to some other stuff. So which of the students would likely agree with the statement that all 4 atoms lie in the same plane? They lie in the same plane. So that means it's flat, right? That they lie in the same plane. Okay, so student 1, well, student 1 is very direct about it, right? All the atoms lie in the same plane, okay? So that's well and good. Student 2, all of the atoms lie in the same plane, okay? Student 3, all the atoms do not lie in the same plane, okay? And student 4, same plane, let's see if we can find that anywhere. Trigonal pyramidal, right? And it says student 3 is correct, but the bond angle is different. So student 3 is correct, but the bond angle is different. And student 3, of course, said they do not lie in the same plane. Okay, so back to the question, which would likely agree with the statement all 4 atoms lie in the same plane? We saw 1 and 2 only, right? 3 specifically said they do not lie in the same plane. 4 said 3 is right. Okay, so again, just go straight to the information. If you're doing more than that, you're wasting your time. It's just not in your best interest. I took this practice test. Good. So I hope this is good review. I might as well look at another question or two while we're there. The thing about the science section is it really is super straightforward. I've had students who have come back and been like, after doing some practice and taking some tips, have said, wow, I can't believe I was ever scared of this. This is kind of stupidly easy. So looking at question 4 there are 3 unique bond angles. This is consistent with whose description. So again, there are 3 unique bond angles. Who says this? Now, looking at the answer choices here, I'm probably going to want to start with student 2, just because student 2 comes up in 2 of the answer choices. So if I know it's not student 2, well, then I can eliminate F and G, and then I won't bother with student 1. Okay, so 3 unique bond angles. So student 2, 1 unique bond angle. Well, clearly then student 2 doesn't say there are 3 unique bond angles. Let's look at students 3 and 4. So student 3, there is only 1 unique angle. Well, it can't be 3 then. 1 unique bond angle. So it can't be 3. I know it's not 2, so it's got to be none of the above, right? It's got to be none of the students. And then we move on, right? So don't read the passages. If you're going to read the passages, do it solely for the purpose of reading the italicized text. And then it's best practice to at least read the background, especially on the multiple sciences passages, the multiple scientist passages, where they'll tell you, you know, scientist 1 says this, scientist 2 says this. It's good to read the background there to at least get a strong sense for what it is the 2 scientists are comparing, right? What are the students potentially, or the experiments, the different hypotheses, whatever they give you. What are they actually searching for an answer to? That way you kind of don't go in blind. You have at least a little bit of background. I just try for 5 minutes a passage and it seems to work. Yeah, the problem with timing is that not every passage is necessarily going to take you the same amount of time. So, you know, if you take the 40 questions and kind of chunk that down into 7 or 8 question blocks based on the time, you don't want to be spending maybe more than 6 minutes on a passage. 6 or maybe 7, right? That would be pushing it. But 6 minutes is really kind of the upper limit to how much time you should have on any given passage. So obviously you do want to push for time, but I think time really is a secondary concern. You shouldn't be rushing against the clock on the science portion. And I would go more on a per question basis. At least that's where I feel comfortable, where I know that if I'm spending more than 30 seconds on a question, that's too long. Right? Because these questions are really straightforward. There's nothing that they'll ever ask you on the science portion that can't be explained in a minute, right? So if you're spending 30 seconds trying to find these details, that's when you know, okay, I'm making this more difficult than it needs to be. So I'm either going to move on to the next question, or I'm going to step back for a moment and go, okay, what am I missing? It's got to be something pretty obvious that I'm just overlooking. I'm making this way too tough on myself. But if on the science you're doing 5 minutes a passage and it seems to work, that's great, so long as you're getting all the questions correct, right? So if you're going fast but to the exclusion of accuracy, then that's not necessarily a good thing, right? If you're finishing in time but you're getting a 30, whereas you could have maybe not finished all the questions, but the 35 questions that you did get, you got all correct, and maybe then you'd have gotten a 32 or a 33, well, then you're not hedging your odds there in a best way. So again, time is obviously a concern for the science and I think the reading as well, but don't just rush through for the purpose of finishing in some sort of prefixed time commitment. You're saying, let's see, on the actual test, I had like 8 minutes. Is that a bad sign or is it a good sign? So it sounds like you haven't gotten your score back. But if you have gotten your score back, then it depends on your score, right? I would say some passages are easier, right? Some exams are easier than others to the individual, right? So on the average, some exams, or the exam should be consistent from test administration to test administration, but to an individual, obviously there are going to be some exams that are easier and some exams that are a little bit more difficult. And I think more than anything, that just has to do with the familiarity that you have with the topics that they test. But no, I mean, if when I take these exams, I usually have like 25 minutes left over, right? And I don't, not to brag, but they really are easy questions. And when you've taken all of the practice exams a million times, you know every type of question they're going to throw your way. You see those patterns repeating over and over. Then you should have a lot of time left over, right? It really shouldn't take you that whole 35 minutes. You should have plenty of time to go back and check your answers. So no, I would say if you're going fast, that's not a problem, right? If you can finish the exam in 15 minutes and get them all correct, that's not problematic at all. I would worry a little bit on the reading. I would say if you take the reading exam and have about 8 minutes left over, that to me sounds a little too fast. Usually maybe a couple of minutes to spare on the reading is a good sign. I've had some students who get a 36 and have finished with 10 minutes left over on the reading. I can't personally do that. That's a little too fast for my reading taste. I think that if you're reading carefully and you're being prudent about looking for the questions and answers before going into the passages, that usually should take you about half an hour. But no, if you got 8 minutes left over, your score will be a better sign than the amount of time that you had left over. If you do end up taking the exam again, just make sure that the practice that you do comes from real ACTs, right? Don't do the practice out of Kaplan or Barron's or Princeton Review, whatever. There's so many released exams that again, you're shooting yourself in your foot to not use the real exams, especially the more recent ones. So let me go back to that reading passage that I was doing earlier. And I just want to focus a little bit more on what to read ahead of time? Let me answer these questions real quick. You said, what should I read in my free time for reading passages? Yeah, the ACT is really, fortunately, predictable in the types of passages that it gives to you, right? You know that first passage is always going to be some narrative fiction, right, or prose fiction, literary narrative, whatever they call it now. And you know in the middle you're going to have a humanities passage and a social science passage, and then you know passage 4 is going to be a science passage. So go and read those types of passages, right? To prepare for the literary, right, the first passage, just read a novel, right? And try to get a little decent of a spread for the novels that you can read. Go back and read Jane Eyre, right? Read something by the Brontes, or read something by Charles Dickens, and then read something that's a lot more recent, right? Read something by Alice Walker, or read something by some of the writers in the 60s. Clockwork Orange is a really interesting one if you're going to try to go crazy. For the passages in the middle, you said the Atlantic and the New York Times. I'd recommend the New Yorker as well. The New Yorker is a really good publication. The Atlantic is also really good. Just make sure that you're reading articles that have a bit of kind of a sociological bent to them, or an anthropology bent. And what I mean by that is make sure that you could see the passages that you're reading coming up in the social sciences or the humanities passages. But you've seen ones that are biographies of George Washington, right? Or the old Malcolm Gladwell passage about the McLean hamburger. They'll throw pretty much anything your way. So long as you're bulking up your reading speed generally, you're going to do fine. For the science passage, what you should do, I'm assuming if you're here, you probably are from Reddit. So go to Reddit and then go to R Science and filter through some of the passages or the articles that they post on R Science. Luckily with R Science, you can filter it out by the type of science that you're interested in. So if you want to just go, and this is really good for the second and the third passages as well, if you want to just go for economics or sociology, what have you, you can filter those out and get some really quality passages, articles from there. The one thing I would worry about with the sciencey type passages is you don't want to find yourself reading an 80-page paper about the dynamics of the Khmer Rouge or something like that. You want to make sure that you're getting kind of a secondary source, if you will, right? An article that was written to summarize what was going on in a study, or to summarize what some others have found. You can get really technical and nitty-gritty with some of the passages that people will post on R Science. So just make sure you're not getting caught up in the throes of technicalities and jargon. You said I had the official ACT book. The ACT book is fine. I don't really love their answer explanations, which I know sounds a little bit weird because you would think that the answer explanations in the official book are like the answer explanations handed down from Jesus. But they're not really good. They don't. I have found, and I have some students who disagree with me on this, but I have found that those passages, the way that they explain their answers in the official ACT book aren't amazing. Especially if you have the older book, that's no good. I got really excited when they published the newer guide a couple years ago, but then found that they had just recycled old exams into the new practice tests. So it's a good book. The practice tests are worthwhile, but even more worthwhile, go to Crack ACT. I know the list is on Reddit of I think 73 exams. If you search 73 released ACTs, you can find all of the PDFs. They're all on Google Drive of the newer practice exams. So do that. The book is, not only is it really heavy, but it's also kind of pricey, and that's a big problem. On that note, though, it is really helpful to have a physical copy of the test that you're taking. And one other thing about mimicking real exam conditions, make sure, I say this every week, make sure that, especially on the reading portion, you have passage on the left, questions on the right, right? None of this flipping over back and forth nonsense that I see students doing when they print out an exam. Make sure you format it correctly. Passage on the left, questions on the right, just like on the real exam, because that flipping back and forth gives you exposure to an anxiety that you won't experience on the day of the exam. So it's not mirroring real testing conditions. Don't do it. Science is usually my strongest passage. It's just the literary narrative and prose fiction. Yeah, so that's always that first passage. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the ways that you can combat that is to read before the exam. And I obviously you want to read before the exam, but I mean the day of, the morning of. Get to your testing room maybe 20 or 30 minutes early, or get to the school, the center that you're taking it at, a little bit early, and bring a narrative with you. Bring a short story with you. Bring something by Steinbeck, or Steinbeck is, I think, really good for short stories. Or bring a Hemingway short story, right? Bring something that you can actually read that will prepare you for the reading exam. That way, again, you're not just thrown into it. Especially because when are you going to be taking the reading exam? It's right after 45 minutes of English and then an hour of math, and then you've got a little bit of break in between, but your wheels are already spun out. So to throw yourself back into that reading exam is really difficult if your mind hasn't been in that mode recently. The other thing is obviously just read more. So, the thing I said last week is the best thing you can get to prepare for the reading exam is a library card. Just go to the library and go into a section that you find interesting. If you're really interested in history, go to the history section or ask the librarian, hey, where can I find history books? And then just peruse around in that section, find a title that's interesting to you, and then just read it. A lot of the issues that people have with the reading exam are just anxiety about reading generally, that you're not used to reading. Focusing on a piece of text for 10 minutes is really difficult for millennials, right? It just is. You're not used to it. You don't go maybe more than 10 seconds throughout the day without getting interrupted by a notification on Snapchat or Twitter or Instagram, whatever. So then to sit down and try and focus on a text and figure out what these characters are saying to each other, and something about an apple and an orange and a line and what's going on here, that's really tough to do if you don't practice at it. So again, toss your phone aside, go check out something from the library, or if you've got a nice library at home, pull something down off the shelf, especially something that you're not interested in. Right? If you can find something that you're not interested in and still, muster up the focus to be able to figure it out and see what's going on there, that's really good practice. Because usually when I open up that first passage, I go, this is not something I'm interested in, right? I remember that one of the ones was the guy who was swimming. Another one was a young woman with her glove talking to her dad about breaking in the glove. And I just went, I could not care less. But then you just do it anyways, right? And you look for connections between characters. You try to figure out what their relationships are. And again, look at the questions beforehand. You said, do you recommend starting with the science or not? It depends. It really depends. To generalize, I think that the biggest issue that students have with the reading is they try and go for a one-size-fits-all approach to the section, which is not the best way to approach the reading. Those passages are very different. There's a real great disparity, not only between the passages, but also from exam to exam in the types of information that they provide you and the types of questions that they ask you. So it may be the case that on one particular reading exam, on the science, you can just go straight to the questions and don't even have to read the passage, right? You can just go, oh, this scientist said this. Oh, this is what this word means. And go through, 31 through 40 without ever reading the passage. Other times, they ask you really intricate questions that require you to have a really strong understanding of dynamics between ideas and characters or scientists in the passage. So it really depends. I would say I would recommend doing all 4 passages, because to me, the anxiety of potentially, and I bubble as I go, some people recommend not to do that, but that's what I do. The anxiety of potentially misbubbling, or even flipping back and forth between passages, or trying to figure out, okay, now I'm going to do 2. The logistics of that, oh, now I'm going to go to passage 3. Well, I already did 4. Oh, how much time do I have left? That stresses me out. That just adds a number of different confounding variables that I don't want to have present while I'm taking an exam. So I would recommend just doing the passages through. If you're tending to do the science because that's your strongest, well, get rid of that crutch. Find ways to make the first passage equally as strong. That way you feel confident in any order. That's a big thing for students always, is get rid of crutches. If you do something because it's familiar and comfortable to you, and it's more difficult to do it in maybe a more proper or more accurate way, start doing it that other way. Start doing it in a way that requires you to focus a little more energy on things that you're not as good at. So no, pick something up at the library that is foreign to you, that feels a style that's uncomfortable to you, and make it happen. Now, don't just read things for the sake of reading them, right? Don't just read things for completion. Something that is assigned to you for class at school is usually not good reading preparation for the ACT. And the reason is this, especially for that regard. The assignments that you get at school are all analytical, right? It's all analysis for the reading that you do. And probably if you're like most high school students, you don't even read the assignments that you get from class anyways, right? You go on SparkNotes or Schmoop and just read the summaries because your teacher gives you comprehension quizzes that say, oh, what did Tom do in this chapter, right? But then when you talk, when you have discussions, when you write essays, or hopefully you write your own essays, you're focusing on analytical stuff, right? It's not a matter of what did this word mean at this line, right? What did this character say to this character to make him or her do this? The ACT is very detail oriented. So if you're going to do reading practice for the ACT, you need to be detail oriented. For that, Hemingway is really good practice, right? Hemingway is notoriously terse, right? Very, very short spoken, doesn't use a lot of words, but to the point that all of the details that he mentions are worth mentioning, are worth taking note of, to the point where you can get to something on like the 200th page of Farewell to Arms, and it'll be a callback to something that came up on the second page, and you go, whoa, okay, I should have paid more attention to that. So yeah, I think Hemingway is good for focusing on the kind of detail-oriented, nitpicky stuff that ACT does. Another thing, of course, is practice with the practice passages, right? I mean, use the passages that they give you as good sources of material. If you're looking, for example, here, they say that this passage in the natural science passage comes from this article from Timothy Ferris by the National Geographic Society. Well, there's one of ACT sources, right? They take passages from the National Geographic. So maybe go check out a National Geographic from your library. Indeed, go to the 2009 National Geographic where this particular article came from as a good source, right? Go through and find if they're pulling passages out of anthologies, if they're pulling passages from an author who you find interesting, or better yet, an author who you find really difficult to read, right? Kind of tough to get through their prose. Go and read that author. Right? So do the things that you're not comfortable with as opposed to defaulting to the things that you have been doing that aren't getting you ahead, would be my advice there. So yeah, while we're here on this passage, let me go back to what I was saying earlier about kind of preparing ahead of time. Don't waste time on the reading passages. Go straight to the questions. If I see a question, for example, like number 34, and it asks me, okay, you know, what's the main idea of the second paragraph? I might just go next to the second paragraph and you know, just make a quick note to myself. Wow, that is a really thick pen. Make a quick note to myself that hey, question number 4 is, yeah, it's still a thick pen. Question number 4 is from that part of the exam. And then move on, right? There's nothing more to do on that question. Although when I do read this paragraph, I'm aware of the fact that, okay, that's going to correspond to question 34. So looking at question 35 here, the passage's description of the spectroscopic Doppler technique, right, indicates that it identifies what? So all I'm going to be looking for here is the spectroscopic Doppler technique, right? When I find that in the passage, ding, 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 lights go off, I know that that's where I'm getting my answer from, okay? I might even want to make a note to myself on the side that, you know, the spectroscopic Doppler technique, right? I'm going to be looking out for that. And then when I find that in the passage, hey, that's something worth noting. Again, on first look, I wouldn't be watching out for spectroscopic Doppler technique. Those are not words that would jump out to me as important just from reading the passage through one time. But if I read the question ahead of time, I know I'm looking for that. Now, does simply finding it in the passage give me the answer? No, but I'm confident that if you can find where a detail comes up in a passage, you can answer the question that corresponds to that information. The biggest issue that a student would have on something like this question here is actually finding that detail to begin with, not doing the necessary kind of grunt work to then figure out the answer to the question itself. Okay. By the way, if I see spectroscopic Doppler technique, I might want to search for the word Doppler because that's capitalized. Spectroscopic may not jump out to me in the passage nearly as much, but the word Doppler, because it's capitalized, does. And indeed, just on quick skimming over here, I found the word Doppler here and here. It looks like they're talking about it here, and of course here I now find spectroscopic Doppler technique. So I know my answer most likely, and this is really important, my answer most likely comes there. Okay, this is a trap that some students will fall into on occasion. So you'll find that the question mentions a particular term. You go and find that term, and then you think to yourself, okay, well, I must have my answer from that region. Here's the spectroscopic Doppler technique, so the answer better come from there. And indeed, I think in this particular situation, it does. But I just want you to be aware of the fact that sometimes you'll find a term in one passage, but then it's referenced or alluded to in a later paragraph that actually provides the content for the answer. Okay, so just don't get locked into that. That said, again, what you're looking out for here is find a detail ahead of time so you know that you're looking for that specifically and you won't miss it, right? You won't miss it in the passage. It'll jump out to you. Okay? Let me look at one more. Number 39 is another type of those questions that may pose an issue for you if you're just trying to remember what came up in the passage, but can't hold all of those details in. So 39 here says, hey, in the passage, what are Deneb and Vega? Well, okay, find Deneb and Vega, right? And again, hopefully those will jump out to you. Though this would be an easy one probably to skim as well because you see those words that are capitalized. Okay, so I'm skimming over, I'm looking for Deneb and Vega, and if it takes a little while, this is the issue that I want you to be aware of, right? I'm skimming over Deneb and Vega. Now I have found it here, right? Deneb and Vega. It says these are bright stars. These are bright stars. So anyways, hopefully that gives me an indication of what my answer would be. They're not scientists. They're not planets. It says they were bright stars, so at least now I've narrowed them down to two. Are they former stars, or are they stars at the edge of the area of the Kepler? Okay, well, reading back in this paragraph, okay, wide field, the light of more than 100,000 stars, between the bright stars, Deneb and Vega. Okay, between those stars. So it says basically you've got this whole area. It makes wide pictures capturing the light between those two. So that suggests to me that those are on the edges, and that would lead me to A. But the point I want to make here is that if you're reading that question and you're skimming over for Deneb and Vega, the longer it takes you to find it, the greater your anxiety will become. And I've been in this situation before, and I don't want you to put yourself in that situation where you know what you're looking for, and just for the life of you, you cannot find it. And you go, oh, I must be an idiot, right? Deneb and Vega, I've got to be able to find it, and it just doesn't jump out at you. You'll go crazy during the exam. Trust me. So the way to get around that, the way to avoid that anxiety from the outset is circle Deneb and Vega from the beginning, write down Deneb and Vega, right? Stupid details, whatever they are, and then when you find them, it'll jump out to you from the very beginning. Okay? That way, again, you don't find yourself lost in this really, really difficult and anxiety-inducing game of hide and seek. That's not what this exam should become if you're preparing for it properly. Okay, so just to leave it at that for the reading, read the questions first, but don't just read the questions. Spend a good minute or so finding the pieces of information that you're going to then go find in the passage, right? If I read 39 and I don't tell myself that these are the keywords that I'm looking for, I've wasted my time reading that question. There's just nothing useful that I take away from that. Okay. The same thing would be true on number 34, but in the reverse direction. If I see this question and then I go back into the passage, but I've decided beforehand to read F, G, H, and J, and I'm going to try to hold all of that information in my mind, it's a total waste. I'm not going to get anything useful out of it because it's a main idea question, right? I have to go back and read the paragraph. So again, to synthesize that down into a really specific piece of advice, find the details that you would struggle to find in the questions, find those, and write down those pieces of information that you think you would miss were it not for having read the questions first, right? If you do that, you'll find that these passages become a heck of a lot easier and aren't nearly as problematic, okay? Let me clear this one out of the way. And so I'll bring up an English section. Haven't looked at English in a bit, and I just want to go over a couple of things there. I think most people tend to not struggle too much with the English section, but it's always good to go over regardless, just to make sure that you're doing questions properly. A lot of students will tell themselves, okay, I'm pretty sure I know how to do this one, but then they actually don't. So that's a problem I want to make sure we avoid from the outset. Let me clear this, and clear this. Oh, no, I wanted to unlock you. There we go. Okay. So just looking over an English passage here, the first question is a really commonly missed piece of grammatical law here, so it's good that this one happens to be the one that I pulled up. So it says, in her Princeton lab, right, in her lab at Princeton University, molecular biologist Bonnie Bassler leans over a collection of petri dishes, her face illuminated by an aquamarine glow. So this first question has a lot of common rules going into it, and you need to know these well. So in her lab at Princeton University, we have an option to put or not put the comma in this location, right? Again, we can put the comma there, or with choice D here, not put the comma. So I want to deal with that first. In her lab at Princeton University, that's an introductory clause, right? It's introducing information. It's setting up the rest of the sentence. If you see a prepositional phrase, right, in as a preposition, if you see that at the beginning of a sentence, it should be followed by a comma if it's introductory, okay? So I like that comma there. I'm going to get rid of D. Now, comparing between the others, I have the option to put the comma after Bonnie Bassler or not put the comma after Bonnie Bassler, and that might be a place that I want to look at as well, but we should know the rule here, okay? The question we've got here is whether molecular biologist is extra information, right? Whether molecular biologist here is parenthetical to the name Bonnie Bassler, all right? So go and go on to, again, the Purdue OWL is a great resource for grammar. Go on to the Purdue OWL, make sure you know your grammar rules, go to the comma section under punctuation on the left, it'll say general writing, and then you go to punctuation and go to commas, you'll get all those rules. To generate a parenthetical here would be a mistake. And the reason is that molecular biologist or Bonnie Bassler here doesn't stand either on its own or not on its own. So let me explain what I mean by that. The first thing you want to do on a question like this is boil it down to its simplest element. So what is the basic sentence? You learned back in maybe first or second grade, a sentence has a subject and a predicate, right? It's a doer and then that thing that is done, okay? Subject and predicate. Figure out what your subject and predicate are. Here, the subject and predicate are Bonnie Bassler, that's my subject, and leans. That's my predicate, right? Bonnie Bassler leans. That's my core sentence. So I want to look there for any of the grammatical relationships around. Now, I know that Bonnie Bassler is a molecular biologist. The question is whether molecular biologist is describing her or whether it defines her, right? Whether she is defined as a molecular biologist or whether she's described as a molecular biologist. Okay, so I always, when you're thinking about these parenthetical type questions, you want to put it in terms of defining or describing. Defining or describing, yeah? So molecular biologist describes Bonnie Bassler. It describes her. It doesn't define who she is, right? She's not the molecular biologist, right? It describes who she is. So in this situation, molecular biologist Bonnie Bassler is really just like her title. Right? It's really just her title, so there's no reason to offset that from her name with a comma. I don't like this comma here. It puts an awkward pause, right? Molecular biologist, Bonnie Bassler leans over. It's just totally unnecessary to be there. This is not the best example of this type of question, so I'll go over another one that makes it a little bit clearer, but this comma does not need to be there, all right? Look into that with defining versus descriptive information. You can also look at that in terms of, think of it as kind of limiting or non-limiting or restrictive versus non-restrictive information for commas around names and titles. Okay, so between those two, right, we need the comma because it's at the end of an introductory clause. This comma here is really problematic because we know that the subject of the sentence is Bonnie Bassler, the predicate is leans. Never, ever, ever separate a subject and a predicate with just one comma. That's like the worst rule, the cardinal rule that you can break in comma usage, okay? So don't separate subject and predicate with one comma. That gets rid of B for me. Between A and C, again, I don't need that comma after molecular biologist, so I like C. You said, can you explain commas between two adjectives? Yeah, sure. You put commas between adjectives that are coordinate. Okay, so again, check out the Purdue OWL, and they'll give you good information about that. But commas between adjectives comes down to coordinate versus non-coordinate, right? And that's really the key word there is coordinate adjectives. So the situation is this. If you can switch the order of adjectives reasonably, then you put commas between them. And so if I'm thinking about, for example, my old red dog, okay, can I reasonably switch the order of those adjectives? Would it be okay to talk about my red old dog? And the answer is that depends on the context, but most likely I can switch those around without having any substantial change in the meaning, right? So I can move old and red around, and so I like to think of the comma as a pivot point around which I can rotate those adjectives, all right? Now, what's really going on is I need to consider whether this is a red dog that happens to be old, right? Like it's definitely a red dog and I'm just telling you that it's old, or is it a dog that's both old and red? Okay, so that may seem a little bit weird. Let me explain that. Again, if I have commas, right? If I use commas, it means I can switch the order of those adjectives and it doesn't matter. So 95% of the time, that'll get you by, okay? The other thing to consider, however, is let's consider an alternative situation. Let's say I have two red dogs, right? Let's say I have two red dogs. So I'm a terrible artist. So let's just say I have red dog here, right? This is number one, and this one is old. And then I have red dog number two, and this dog happens to be young. Well, in this situation, they're both red dogs. That's not up for consideration. So if I want to specifically tell you that I'm thinking about the old red dog, then I can't switch the words old and red there and retain the same meaning, right? In that situation, it's not both an old and a red dog. It's a red dog who is old, right? So in that situation, I can't switch the order. I wouldn't say it's a red old dog. No, it's an old red dog. So if the order matters, no comma. If the order doesn't matter, I can put them in any order that I please, then you're free to use commas between the adjectives. Importantly, never a comma between the last adjective and the noun that the adjectives are describing. Okay? This gets a little bit complicated when you're dealing with so-called compound nouns. So let me give you an example of that. Let's say you're dealing with, for example, somebody mentioned the New York Times. Okay, so let's do this. I'm dealing with a New York Times article. And the question that some people may have is whether both new and New York Times are adjectives that describe the article. In other words, could I legally put a comma here, right? Would that make sense? It's a new New York Times article. And the answer to that would be no, that's nonsensical. And the reason is that New York Times article is all one big compound noun, right? That's the whole noun, yeah? So I'm not going to separate new because that's the one adjective that describes this whole noun. I'm not going to separate that with a comma because I know that I never put a comma between the last adjective and the noun that it modifies. Now, another way to look at that potentially is to ask yourself, okay, well, could I call it the New York Times new article? And that wouldn't make sense, right? If I put a comma here, that means that I can move those two, what I'm calling adjectives, even though in this case, New York Times is not an adjective, it's just part of the noun. That means that I could move those adjectives around. Well, can I? New York Times, new article? No, that doesn't make sense. I really shouldn't have a pivot point for those adjectives, and so you don't want to include that comma there. Does that make pretty good sense? I know the ACT has had some mildly difficult questions about comma placement between adjectives before, but that is pretty much all the information that you need to get by on those types of questions. Let me go back to that passage from earlier. So again, molecular biologist Bonnie Bassler, that's an example really of a compound noun, right? It's just telling you who the person is. Okay, so she leans over a collection of Petri dishes or Petri dishes, her face illuminated by an aquamarine glow. So I see a semicolon there. That's a really big red flag. If I have a semicolon, I have to have two complete sentences. Now before the semicolon, I do have a complete sentence, right? Bonnie Bassler leans. There's your complete sentence. It may be tempting for somebody to look at her face illuminated and see, oh, here's a verb, so I think face illuminated is the sentence, but illuminated is actually a past participle. It's functioning as an adjective here. Her face is not doing anything. You may also recognize that illuminated doesn't take here a direct object. Okay, so illuminate, you need to illuminate something, right? You need to illuminate something. It needs to have a direct object when you use that verb. Here I don't have it, so it's being used as an adjective, okay? When I've got an adjective phrase like that at the end of a sentence, I can link it on using simply a comma, okay? So I could switch that over to choice J there. I'll look at one more. What you said is coordinate adjectives are weird. That makes more sense. That's good to hear. Importantly, if you know the rule, questions are easy, right? If you know the rules, questions are easy. So if you've done practice specifically with coordinate adjectives and you come across a question, excuse me, you come across a question and go, oh, I think this is a coordinate adjectives question, then you're way ahead of the game because then you can just laser focus. Okay, I know to apply my rule about coordinate adjectives to this particular question. 9 times out of 10, it's simply a matter of figuring out which rule to apply to the topic at hand. I'll look at 47 and 48 here. The glow caused by a particular species of bacteria is confirmation of a phenomenon that Bassler had been investigating for years. Okay, so we've got this opening comma after glow. And again, the first thing that you want to do on any English question, identify the subject and the verb, right? Identify the subject and the predicate in a sentence. So here, the sentence, right, at its core is the glow is, That's the sentence, right? The glow is confirmation. Everything else is extra, right? It tells us what it's confirmation of, it tells us where the glow comes from, but the sentence, the core subject predicate independent clause here is the glow is. All right, so a couple of issues that I have here. The first thing is anything else, like I said, has got to be extra. Here, that comma after glow tells me, okay, I'm introducing extra information about the glow. Okay, well, it's caused by a particular species. And then I end with a comma, right? I end that parenthetical and I say of bacteria. Well, caused by a particular species is very odd. Of bacteria. No, it's caused by a species of bacteria. Yeah, it's a species of bacteria. So that's a whole prepositional phrase that should be included with the species. So I want to get rid of, I want to get rid of this comma here. There's just no need for that. It's a species of bacteria. I don't think many people would misinterpret that. Now, if I get rid of that comma, I do need to introduce a comma after bacteria because that ends the extra information about the glow, right? So the glow caused by a particular species of bacteria. Now I come back to my predicate, the glow is confirmation. Okay. Notice there that again, once I've eliminated that first comma, right, this comma right before the of bacteria, if I get rid of that, I've now got one comma separating the subject and the predicate, and that's never legal. There is no proper grammatical construct that could separate subject and predicate with just one comma. So always be on the lookout for that. Anyways, I want to get rid of the comma after species and add a comma after bacteria, so C looks like a good choice there. All right, and I'll look at 48. It says, as a student in graduate school, Bassler became intrigued with other researchers and their discoveries. So researchers with an apostrophe, right, is got to be possessive, and importantly, you take possession of something. So if you're interested in researchers, apostrophe, it's researchers' things, right? The things that belong to those researchers. In this context, we don't have those things. We don't know what those things would be. She just got interested or intrigued by the researchers themselves. There's no possession. We like choice J. Okay. I want you to take kind of a good note here. This introductory statement, as a student in graduate school, notice that the word that comes right after that introduction is Bassler herself. Right? Bassler was the student in graduate school, not Bassler's intrigue, Bassler's book, the book about Bassler, whatever. No, it has to be her. Whatever is described before the comma, right? Whatever that description is, needs to describe what comes right after the comma. Okay, so that's a dangling modifier type situation. Very, very common on the ACT to have grammar questions related to modifier placement and dangling placement of modifiers. So be on the lookout for that. And as you're going through practice exams, especially on the English portion, take note of what they do for their correct sentences, right? Use their correct sentences as a guide. If something's not underlined, that's proper grammar so far as the ACT sees it. So if you're not sure how to use a comma, you're not sure how to structure a sentence in a particular way, look at the sentences that they've given to you and use those as models to craft the sentences in your answer choices. Okay. We haven't done anything from the math. Usually the math is kind of specific just to very particular questions that students have, so that's why I haven't really done much on it. Let me just bring up two questions here from the math section. This is also from the June 2017 exam, right up at the end. Just a couple quick ones here. So really importantly, know how to use your calculator. Don't forget your calculator on the day of the exam, and just make sure you're really familiar with how to use it properly. Because when I see a question like 58 and I'm dealing with imaginary numbers, I might be a little concerned about how to use I properly. Well, if you've got a TI Nspire, you could literally just plug in x minus 3i cubed and it'll do that for you, right? It'll do that algebraic expansion for you. Anyways, if I look at number 58, there's a lot of ways that I could confuse myself when I see this. This is just a multiplication question, right? If this looks weird to you and you see I and you go, oh, it's cubed, that's a problem, no worries. Take it into binomials that you're comfortable with, right? I've got x minus 3i times x minus 3i times x minus 3i, right? And now I've got simple binomial multiplication that I should know how to do, right? That's definitely something that I've seen before. If I were to multiply these out, I know that that's going to simplify really nicely, especially because minus 3i times minus 3i is going to be 9i squared, which is just minus 9. So I get that final I term to go away. Of course, I have the ix term, but that's not problematic. This should not be difficult if you've ever worked with imaginary numbers. But again, if you see the cube and that's a problem, as always, break it down into something that's a little bit simpler for you, right? Break it down into something that is familiar and that makes a little bit more sense, okay? But that's just foiling. Another way that you could do that, of course, is to, if you pleased, if you had absolutely no idea how to answer this question, then you could just plug in 3i into those formulas and see which one spits out 0, because you know that if you equate that to 0 and you plug in 3i, that should be a 0, right? Here, if x minus 3i is a factor, 3i is a 0, so if I plug in 3i into any of these, it better spit out 0. And so that's a good way to go about it as well. I'll do number 59, and you said, could I do some rates questions? Absolutely. So let me just do 59 really quickly. This is something that you should be really well aware of, how to work with polynomials. So it says which of these is the proper graph. One way to do this, if you had absolutely no idea and you had a couple of minutes left over, just simply go in and graph each of these, right? If you were really struggling and had no idea where to start, just graph those and see what you get. Better yet, I've got a root at -4, a root at 0, and it looks like a root at 6. So if I have a root at -4, I better have x minus -4, so x plus 4 better be a factor. X minus 0, so just x better be a factor. And then at 6, so x minus 6 better be a factor. Okay, so I should have something with those roots. Now the question, of course, is, well, and by the way, x minus 4 on C and B, I can get rid of those, x minus 6 and the x's. Okay, now the question is, what is the degree of each of those? And the simple thing is that if I cross the axis, that's an odd degree root, right, to the first, to the third, to the fifth, what have you. If I bounce off the axis like I do here, then that's an even degree root. So the x plus 4 better have an odd power. All of them have an odd power on x plus 4, so no worries. The x better have an even power because it bounces, right? A bouncing root has an even power. So I can't have to the first, so a is gone. And it can't have x cubed, it's got to be x squared because it bounces. And again, I need to have an odd power on 6, and that's what I have here with x minus 6 cubed. Again, if you were to graph this on your graphing calculator, it would spit that out, and you should have no problem with that. Okay, you said, can I do a rate problem? Yeah, let me see if I can find one. Could you maybe be a little bit more specific, sorry, on what you mean by rate? There are some of those questions. Are you talking about the ones where, because there's a few types, the ones where they'll say, you know, hey, Amanda and John can build a house separately. Amanda can do it in 5 minutes. John can do it in 10 minutes. Paper house, let's say. How long would it take them to do it together or something like that? Or do you mean, you know, there's 2 people running around a track and, you know, when do they catch up? I guess they're kind of the same. So let me just, let me give this example. So first off, if you ever get a rate problem, start out with dirt, right? Start out with distance equals rate times time. And importantly, make sure you understand what that means, right? So instead of just having in your mind, okay, distance equals rate times time, distill that down to something a little bit more general. It's not always a matter of distance, right? You're not always covering a physical distance or a length. Sometimes you're covering the number of houses to be built. Sometimes you're covering the number of bricks to lay on a wall, right? So really, I consider this just the number of jobs that I finish is the number of jobs per time times the amount of time that it takes to complete one of those jobs, right? That's all it is. And if you can get the units to match in a reasonable way, then you should have absolutely no problem with these questions. Indeed, if I ever see a rate problem, the first thing that I look for is units. Make sure that the units are consistent, because when those match, everything falls into place really nicely. So bearing that in mind, let's consider the following situation. Let's say we've got a track like this, and the track around is 400 meters. Okay, that's a pretty standard track, 400 meters around. And let's say that we have, for example, John, and John can run, let's say he's decently fast, he can run 7 meters per second. And we'll have Judy, who can run, let's say, a little slower. Let's say she runs 4 meters per second. And the question I could say, and I think ACT asked this exact question, is what is the time at which John will lap Judy? Which basically just means John is running faster, so eventually he will take one more lap than she does, right? He'll come all the way back around and then pass her again. So at what time will he complete that lap? Okay, so one way that you could structure this problem is that, well, I could do distance equals rate times time, right? I could start out with d equals rt, right, and figure out when their distances would be a certain amount, and that's totally viable. If that's the situation, if that's the constraint that you're going to start with, then you need to formulate the problem in a way that's conducive to solving with that equation. So what I mean by that is that if I'm going by distances, but the question asks when he's going to lap her, then I need to translate that problem into a when is he going to distance her question. Okay, so if I'm thinking in terms of distances, what I'm really asking is when is his distance her distance plus 400 meters, right? When is his distance her distance plus 400 meters? Right? So if I can distill the problem down to that, it becomes very easy, right? But again, if I think I'm going to use distance equals rate times time, I have to translate or transform the problem into something that actually relates to the constraint of the equation. Okay? So at that point, what do I know? I want to know what's the point at which John's distance, so I'm going to say the distance of John, is 400 more than the distance of Judy. And whenever I write something out like that, just to be absolutely certain, I will write the 400 after, right? I know it's 400 more than the other, right? That way I've got absolutely no ambiguity. All right, well, I know that distance is equal to rate times time. What is John's rate? Well, John's rate is 7, and Judy's rate is 4. And what is their time? Well, they run for the same amount of time, right? They run for the same amount of time, so I can just use one variable t for both expressions. So again, John is 7, Judy is 4. I'll scroll that up. So John's distance is going to be 7t, and that's got to be equal to 4t plus 400. And when I solve for that, that'll get me my t, right? So t here would be 400 over 3, right? I'll move the 4 over and then divide both sides by the 3. Importantly, the units there are seconds, right? The units there are seconds. So if my answers are all in terms of minutes or hours, I have to make that conversion, right? If they give me 400 over 3 minutes, well, there's an issue. Okay. Indeed, if it were exactly this problem, the answers would probably be in minutes because the units would work out a little nicer instead of dividing by 3. So make sure you know how to convert. If I've got 400 over 3 seconds, we'll just move this up. Now the problem is just converting units, okay? And I want to convert that to minutes. Make sure your dimensional analysis is really strong, right, that I can convert. So I know that because there are 60 seconds in 1 minute, right, dividing by 60 will get me to minutes. And that could potentially be an answer. But anyways, the way to do this problem is to set it up correctly, right? So start out with dirt, that's fine, but make sure then when you're given the constraints of the problem that you can actually solve it in terms of dirt. Another way that I could have done this is I could have said, okay, well, the number of laps take them a certain amount of time, right? And I could say, okay, well, the number of laps of John is equal to the number of laps of Judy plus 1. That would have been a little bit more complicated, but I could have done it the same way, right? I would say that the number of laps that they complete is equal to the laps per time times time. And all right, well, again, the laps of John better be 1 more than the laps of Judy. Okay, well, what is their rate in laps per time? Well, if that's 700 meters per second, right, 7 meters per second, and there are 400 meters in a lap, right, then John's rate, for example, is 7 over 400 laps per second, right, laps per second. So now I can say, all right, well, then the number of laps that John does is 7 over 400 t. By that same logic, the number of laps that Judy does is 4 over 400 t, and I know that that has to be 1 more, right? The number that John does is 1 more than Judy. So I could do it that way too. You get the same value. Importantly, no matter how you go about it, make sure that the equation that you're using and the units that you're using are consistent. If you're using disparate units and equations, you're going to find yourself doing all sorts of funky things that won't get you anywhere closer to actually getting an answer. So hopefully that makes pretty good sense. Don't lock yourself again into distance equals rate times time. You can also use that for jobs. I'll just do one other example before I head out here. Let's do that other type of example where I've got, let's say Amelia can paint a house in 3 days, and John, different John, can paint it in 8 days. Okay, well, how long will it take them to work together on one house? Right? Well, here, instead of making this a dirt problem, I can just make it a hurt problem, right? The number of houses is equal to the rate times time. And importantly, the units of the rate there, right? If I isolate for rate, that's h over t. The units for rate are houses per time. So the question is, well, what is Amelia's rate? Well, it's 3 days to 1 house, right? So it's 1 house per 3 days, right? 1 over 3 is her rate, and 1 over 8, by the same logic, would be John's rate. Okay, well, their rate working together is the sum, right? I add them together. So to complete 1 house would take their rates together what amount of time? Okay, and importantly, again, based on units, this t will be in days because those were the units that we used to establish the rate. Okay, so all of those problems are almost exactly the same. It's just, again, making sure that the equation that you use matches the units that you're using. And of course, that you extend the problem to the equation that you're using. What I mean by that is, if I have this John and Judy running around the track problem, but I don't get this equation correct, well, then obviously I can't answer the problem. Right? There's just no way I can get that question correct without setting up that equation first. So if that is at all an issue, go back into maybe an Algebra 1 textbook and look for where they have modeling word problems with equations where they'll say, hey, twice x is equal to half the square root of quantity x minus 3 squared or whatever. And make sure that you can write those out, right? If 2x is 9 greater than half y, right, what's the equation for that? So sometimes people tend to struggle on those as well. I've got time maybe to answer one more question. So if you've got any other concerns that I can address, or if you'd like me to go over another rate type problem, I'll certainly be willing to do that. Okay, good. Go write your essay, and I'll head out too. Importantly, to kind of just summarize everything I've said today, be really judicious with the ways that you're going about everything. Everything is a matter of time. Don't focus on time necessarily, but focus on saving time, obviously, in your strategies. Whether that's going and learning the grammar rules so that you have no problem. Go and if you run into, hey, I struggle with rate problems. Okay, go back into an Algebra 2 textbook and do all the rate problems until you've absolutely got that down. If you're struggling on the reading, go and read more. Look at the questions ahead of time. Make notes to yourself about the details that you're trying to find. on the science. Go straight to the questions, right? Do exactly as the questions say. If they say look at student 4, don't look at student 2. If they say table 1, don't look at table 2, etc. So be very, very cautious, be very focused, and at the end of the day, the thing that I wish everybody would always remember is that this exam, the ACT, is not a difficult exam. The types of questions that they ask you are really, really dead pat easy, and you know, there are definitely things that are tough if you don't know them, but you can learn them very quickly, right? There's nothing that they ask you that is outside the scope of, you know, an average 9th or 10th grader's knowledge. Nothing should really be holding you back from a 36. So good luck. Hopefully I'll see you soon, and have a good week. And for you, good luck on your civil rights movement essay. Take care. Bye-bye.